Yeah.
National_aquarium.
Yes.
Okay. Should we go ahead and get started? All right, excellent. So welcome to the Submerged Culture Resource Working Group. I'm not sure if we're actually going to be able to pull this off in 90 minutes. I think we're going to be in a more compressed schedule than before, but my name is Dominique Rissolo. I am an archaeologist. I work mostly in the coastal environment, worked mostly in the Caribbean and Yucatan Peninsula. And I'm not here because of necessarily any specific seniority or expertise other than perhaps representing archaeology on the National Ocean Exploration Advisory Board, but certainly willing to play this role as moderator as we sort of move through our topics today. And again, a bit of background, I'm at the University of California, San Diego with the Center for Interdisciplinary Science for Art, Architecture, and Archaeology, and do both terrestrial and coastal and underwater archaeology as well. And I'm also was supported by a NOAA grant for one of our big projects in the Yucatan Peninsula, so there's a little bit of history there with OER. And you know, this is obviously an exciting topic, and this is one that's come up during the course of the last now day and a half. And what we'll do is we'll just sort of run through with how we're going to structure this discussion today. Frank is going to be our rapporteur, I think is how we're referring to your role. And this is actually very important because what we need to do, this is not meant to be a free-form discussion, but rather one that's structured. And we might feel that that structure is maybe imposing an inflexible template on what otherwise might be an organic and productive discussion. We want to think about it that way, but we really do need to follow these 9 questions that were presented to all of the working groups. This will better enable us to report on the recommendations from those of us who are participating here today in a way that is consistent with reporting from the other working groups. So we really want to do our best to fit our recommendations, our ideas, our observations into this format in order for them to sort of make it into the record and potentially inform the kinds of decisions that will be made in the next several years with respect to the role or the importance of submerged culture resources in our National Ocean Exploration Program. So I think I would like at least to take, if we can, just a couple of minutes for those of us here to just quickly introduce themselves. I don't want, just, it could even just be name and affiliation. I think that would be nice, and since we're going to be spending the next hour or so together, and then we'll go into the structure.
No, that's fine. I was trying to get our support first.
Okay.
I'm Frank Cantellis, and I'm with the Office of Ocean Exploration and Research at NOAA, and we're a marine archaeologist there.
Katie Wagner, also with NOAA's Office of Exploration and Research. I do communications and outreach.
Emily Crump, also with the Office of Ocean Exploration and Research, and I do online communications, so web.
Matt King, I'm also with OER, and I'm a web developer and graphic design.
Sitting in, I'm Megan Driscoll with the National Aquarium.
Jim Delgado, NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, Maritime Heritage, and an archaeologist. Recovered.
David Alberg, Superintendent for NOAA's Monitor National Marine Sanctuary.
Joe Hoyt, archaeologist for the Monitor National Marine Sanctuary.
Bob Ballard, President of the Ocean Exploration Trust and Director of the Center for Ocean Exploration at the Graduate School of Oceanography, University of Rhode Island.
And Jonathan Knowles, Head of Maritime Research and Development for Autodesk, with a focus on all things maritime, including underwater archaeology. We make software tools.
And those joining us remotely today?
I'm Erica Bergman. I'm a submarine pilot, National Geographic Explorer, and the founder, hi Jim, and the founder of Girls Underwater Robot Camp.
And I'm Amy Gussick. I'm a professor of archaeology at California State University at San Bernardino. Hey. And I conduct underwater archaeological research in relevance to peopling of the New World along the eastern Pacific coast.
Yeah, well, we have a fantastic group today. And again, let's go ahead and sort of jump in, but quickly discuss the structure, or how our discussion today is to be structured. There's a series of 9 questions, and I'll be asking those 9 questions. And Frank and I are tasked with both moderating and recording your input relevant to those 9 questions. Now, the idea here, as you already know, is to imagine, in some ways hypothetically, an expedition. and we want to look at what that, have a sense of what that expedition might look like. And again, this is, I don't want to be too rigid in applying this template, but I think that we need to sort of move through this. But before we sort of jump into these questions, it's kind of incumbent upon us to identify an area of research, and I mean that both geographically and topically. And I'd like to at least put it to the group for discussion, the possibility of focusing on the Pacific coast of the continental United States, and again, addressing what is of interest to many of us, and that's the submerged Pleistocene shoreline, and the kinds of research that would inform our understanding of what's been termed aquaterra, right? So the now submerged coastline that obviously is a big mystery in terms of our understanding not only the peopling of the New World, but the kinds of coastal processes that gave rise to the North America that we know today. So again, if our charge is to characterize the unknown, then to me this seems like a very promising frontier for the kinds of research that are inherently and almost by requirement interdisciplinary, allow us to bring to bear on a characterization of this unknown submerged landscape, a broad range of techniques, technologies, ideas, really. And so if that's something that we want to explore as a topic that maybe we guide us through this conversation, that does not preclude including the broad range of submerged cultural resources, shipwrecks, for example, that would not go ignored should we have assets within that area for a particular kind of expedition or series of expeditions focusing on this topic. So any sort of initial comments or feelings about the idea of sort of looking to that as our kind of mission topic?
I say let's proceed.
Okay, well, very good. And obviously there's some folks who, Amy for example, and myself and others who have specific academic interest in this topic, but that's not necessarily why I was selected. This is something that's come out of conversations with a number of individuals as the OEAP has convened and talked about those priorities and areas of priority research in underwater archaeology or more generally submerged cultural resources. So the first question, if we're going to pursue this as a topic, is what priorities will you address during the expedition? So it has us here to think about the requirements that will drive the expedition. What information do you need to characterize this feature or region? What activities do you need to accomplish to consider the expedition a success? Think about the current state of your thematic area and how it will change in the next 5 to 10 years. Does this influence your priorities? And I have a few comments, but I want to open it up and sort of get the ball rolling.
I'm a geologist, not an archaeologist, but I certainly cut my teeth early before I jumped into the deep blue on the continental Mars in the United States, and went to USC and did a lot of work on the continental borderland, which is what we seem to be talking about. And as you know, during the Holocene transgression, there were multiple times when the ocean stopped rising. We now are starting to understand why it did those still stands. And it didn't just do a linear rise, and that was because major dams all over the planet that were blocked by glacial moraines built gigantic lakes. I worked off of the east coast of the United States where the Hudson River was dammed by a giant glacier. It built a lake that took up 5 or 6 states, and then it went, and it was cataclysmic breakage and brought animals down, and most of the topography off of New York and Long Island is a glacial flood, where it just came out in such profusion. But certainly when we were working there, and I would assume the similar counterpart, you would have different still stands, different shorelines. Certainly the first priority ought to be to know your topography to a point where you know where the still stands were. Because what we were doing was working with archaeologist Kevin McBride, in particular a Native American archaeologist for the Mashantucket Pequot Nation. was to look at the morphological modeling to be able to say, okay, if you had this terrain, where would you live in it? And clearly you want to be on a river where a river comes in to the ocean. You want the multiple habitats that create the multiple food sources, wetlands and others. And in that case, they were eating a lot of mollusks, and they created huge kitchen middens, piles of shells that survive. The key is, remember, when the sea level advances, it's destructive as it advances over this ancient landscape. So there was that issue of what's the general reconnaissance of the area? Where are those 4 or 5, in the case of off in New England, 4 or 5 times where the ocean stopped and built a shoreline where you could actually look at it as a morphological feature and then use it as your hunting tool. That was one strategy. The other strategy was not the case on the East Coast, but it's been the case in other Neolithic settings around the world, is where you have limestone or where you have caves. And as you said in your own research, one of the things about caves is they survive the rise. And so off the California coast and in particular, I'm sure there's landscapes with the Monterey Shale that are limestone landscapes that I would certainly be looking for caves. So I think you need this first order of understanding the landscape instead of just jumping immediately into a spot and then realize you missed it by a couple hundred yards. So certainly I think your first strategy should be precision, high resolution mapping, which can easily be done with shallow water AUV systems. You can sit on the beach and have a party while it's mapping.
To that end, I think the segue with what Bob's saying is, I think coming back to the multidisciplinary model, integrating really good solid geology and having good geologists with you, because it's going to be different. And in some cases on the coast, we know there's been subduction. It's not, in addition to the processes of transgression, there's going to be other geological processes that are going to make that either shallower or deeper than you might expect than just that 100-meter sort of boundary. And I agree with Bob. I mean, the highest precision mapping is going to be critical to understanding those earlier forms and what the morphology is. But then I think just the cave idea has always intrigued me, particularly after the French discovery of Gussick, where you actually, in that kind of system, you know, didn't completely flood. But the ability to have robotic capacity to not only locate, but small enough to penetrate caves and to do kind of really detailed characterization and even sampling, I think would be absolutely critical. Even if it's a rock shelter, for lack of a better word, is an ideal habitat location, even on a temporary basis. But with that, then I think if we're going to really blue sky it, you need to have the kind of a robot that's going to be able to probe. Because I think what you're going to be looking for in those cases is not only lithic scatter, which is about all we look for, or a shell mount, it's going to be DNA.
Yeah, and we'll certainly get into the technology when we get to question 5. And before I add a comment to that, Amy, I didn't know if you wanted to jump in with the...
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so this is actually very germane to a project that we're currently conducting right now with BOEM around the Channel Islands and also off of Oregon, and Jim Delgado knows about this project as well. And, you know, I think really integral to understanding where you need to kind of focus in this really vast underwater environment, number one is to understand a lot of times terrestrial analogs. So where are we seeing the sites on land, you know, that are kind of pushing early Holocene, late Pleistocene boundaries? That gives you at least some sort of guidance to really be able to understand what types of resources were they targeting, you know, where can we look for these resources in the underwater environment? And then back to Bob's point about, you know, really kind of understanding the, you know, sea floor and kind of mapping the sea floor. Yes, but before you actually are able to do that, you really should get together, you know, possibly any sort of data that you already have and be able to do kind of GIS analysis. So we've been able to do this and conduct a GIS analysis along the entire Pacific coast that really focuses in on a number of different factors, including the rate of relative sea level rise. So we all know, there's static sea level rise, but it is important to know kind of more specifically in the area that you're going, where you need to focus and what depths you need to focus on. Where were those shorelines located at 14, 15, 16,000 years ago? What depths should you be focusing on to target this habitation? Identifying areas of hydrology, so paleo river channels, those kinds of things, that can all be modeled through GIS analysis. Looking at different sedimentation rates. So in order to identify terrestrial surfaces, you need to understand how deep the marine sedimentation rate is. If we can have that information, sometimes you can obviously get that information at a later date through coring. But these are a lot of the types of things that need to be considered along with preservation. So preservation potential is a really big one, because if you do have if there is decent preservation, then you obviously have the ability to try to identify sites. But if those sites have been destroyed, through poor preservation, through extreme wave energy, those kinds of things, which is a problem on the Pacific coast, then there's going to be areas that are going to be better to focus in on because they do have better preservation potential. So these are all definitely things to consider before you even kind of hop in the water, before you throw that sonar in the water. But then, of course, the next step is really targeting areas for, kind of broader sonar imaging, side scan, particularly sub-bottom. That's one thing that we're lacking in terms of current data for submerged prehistoric is sub-bottom. We have a decent amount of bathymetric data, a decent amount of side scan sonar data, but the sub-bottom profiler data we're completely lacking. And that is, really from my perspective, some of the most integral data that we could have, because we're going to have to locate those terrestrial surfaces and really get an understanding of the sedimentation rates and where we can actually identify those terrestrial landforms that we're looking for.
Yeah, this is great because I think you've said we are really talking about priorities here, and it really fundamentally is characterization of both the terrestrial and the submerged coastline. And this is basic to any number of related studies where we do these space sea levels description of the kinds of sediments that that one would expect to find in these areas.
You're also looking for non-depositional, non-erosional, what we call relic surfaces. And surprisingly, a significant amount of the continental shelf does not have sediments going over it. They're being ducted by subsurface distribution patterns, and if you can identify your relic surfaces that have neither been destroyed nor buried, that's the hunting ground that you really want to look into. Is that also, as we experienced off of Turkey and in the Mediterranean, the trawling activities, the destructive nature of bottom trawlers that are going after flounder or whatever, we found the best hunting was in rocky terrain. There was materials that they could use for construction, but also the trawlers didn't go in there. And so it's a harder place to hunt, but it might be a more productive place to hunt. So that kind of consideration.
So this is good, and I also like the way where this conversation is going, and that we really are focused on that primary sort of characterization rather than talking about site prospection at this point. And I think that's something to keep in mind, that this is not about necessarily going out as a first order of business to look for sites associated with this early peopling of the Americas. That presents any number of practical challenges. The sites are ephemeral by nature. You're dealing with higher energy environment, biological and sedimentological overburden, etc. These are things that we're all familiar with, and certainly not the case in coastal caves, but the case for the most part along coastline. So what's really most important is that fundamental characterization in a very targeted discipline sort of way, in a way that informs the kinds of research that the archaeologist is setting as a priority, but also contributes a wealth of information to a broad range of researchers that are interested in that the submerged landscapes for other academic reasons. So that's one of the things I should mention that I really like about this topic, is that this is not just serving the cultural heritage practitioner or the underwater archaeologist. These kinds of data are of interest to, I think, the broadest possible group of people working not only underwater in coastal areas, but working terrestrially in coastal areas. So, and I like the fact that Andy brought that up. So I think we're sort of off to a good start. The next question we want to address is who our partners would be, and this has actually come up quite a bit at this national forum and as well in the Ocean Exploration Forum 2020. That partnerships are obviously going to be key to realizing any ambitious type of expedition like one we're potentially proposing here. And the question reads, who are the partners? What partnerships will you leverage as part of your expedition? Who are the stakeholders you will be working with? Are there ties to federal or state needs? What international partnerships might make sense? Will your expedition include academics, private industry, or NGOs, etc.?
All of the above.
Exactly. I think one of the things I think is a really key point is that we absolutely have to involve the traditional indigenous community.
That's in my notes.
So, I mean, absolutely key, as with the case of the archaeologists.
When you cross over the border into Canada.
Yeah. Even when you cross over the border in Canada, precisely. The point being, they have oral tradition. They talk about this. The Narragansett Cape Wind really brought that out. So I think having their participation, and not as a token consultation, but as a real involvement, and including traditional knowledge where it is there as oral tradition or others, I think that's going to be key.
So where do you draw the line as far as proximity? Is it just the nearest adjacent travel community, or because you could?
Well, that's hard.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, we had that same issue off of New England because the Pequots are actually Worcester's late arrivals, you know, and so who were the actual who were they really related to? And also in that area, what tradition was burial and artifacts within the burial sites, which are then not disturbed because they've been buried. But then you get into the tradition of you don't dig those burial sites up. So yes, involving the indigenous people is to sort of understand, well, who are they?
Yeah, which groups?
In many cases, they're no longer there.
Well, and it certainly, I mean, the big case I think everybody's mind is Kennewick Man, where, you know, this tribe that claims ancestry, but hard to say. But I mean, I think.
Right. So I guess the question is, it better to go broad and be as
inclusive
as possible?
I think
it'd be sensitive, and sensitive.
Yes.
To be
and inclusive, and understand though that at a certain stage, I mean, clearly there can have to be some protocols set up, but it'll be fraught with difficulty, to be sure, like all things human. But I think inclusivity is the better approach than some exclusivity. In terms of the international partnerships, the other thing I'm thinking of is, of course, the Europeans have spent a lot of time focusing on this through splash costs. They've invested a lot of time, a lot of thinking, and they've actually been doing a lot of ground truthing, because about half of Europe, as it was, is underwater, and they're finding sites.
We got a lot of limestone caves, too, off France.
They do, but in addition to those, I mean, just even in the mud, off of Scandinavia, they're getting footprints, they're getting fish weirs, they're finding all sorts of stuff from 10,000 years ago that's now inundated. So while there are going to be some clear differences because of the cultures and the geology and the geography, I think they have some experience to bring to bear.
That's a good.
But a no-brainer partner, because I'm on the board of trustees at UC Santa Barbara, and the most you know, I won't say most, but a large percentage of archaeologists are affiliated with universities, with academia. Yeah. And I certainly know in the case of UCSB, the engineering department there. I was just down just a few days ago. They were you know, all involved in robotics and AUVs, and the first thing they do is a shallow water one, because of the costs of going deep is pretty prohibitive. But you have all throughout the universities of the United States engineering departments that are messing around with underwater vehicle systems and simple robotic systems, and they are great partners because you need that kind of expertise, and they actually have the resources to actually mount mapping expeditions. To me, engineering department, geology department, reach within your own university, you should find your significant players and stakeholders.
No, that's excellent. It's a good point. The question also here includes, are there ties to federal and state needs? And certainly when you're talking about better understanding of the watershed, coastal processes, navigation, et cetera, I mean, all of these things come into play when we're doing the kinds of...
Well, certainly if it's a sanctuary.
Yeah, and that's
but also to the point, if it's bone,
yeah.
and they're going to put a development in, they don't want to inadvertently destroy a site that could rewrite our understanding of people in the Americas.
So I mean, this is relevant. I mean, it's not only that we would be approaching these partners because we feel that we're in need of their support. These partners are probably very much in need of the kinds of questions we're asking.
Particularly, I know BOEM is particularly interested in defining this because they run into this issue with if you're unable to, they're used to issuing lease blocks based on more traditional maritime heritage sites like shipwrecks and things, which have very defined boundaries. They were talking about paleo landscapes and potential habitation sites. Knowing where those boundaries might be and how those might apply under things like National Historic Preservation Act are critically important to them because they're kind of shrugging their shoulders of how do we deal with this because the Native American groups are potentially going to serve affiliation with those things.
Yeah, and also I should mention that BOEM has made significant investment in building collaborative relationships with First Nation Native peoples in Alaska and Canada, and they've already a very strong tradition of being aware of these kinds of.
To Bob's comment on sanctuaries.
She wants to say something.
Yeah, Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, it's over here on the computer screen. One of the partners that we haven't talked about yet and didn't throw it in there in priorities, but I noticed reading the 2020 guide from last year, priority number 1 is making sure that there are other opportunities for citizen explorers to participate in shipboard operations, this kind of thing. So I think coming up with a partner who can create analog situations for whatever cultural resource we choose. Perhaps it is a cave, something maybe along the continental shelf that a citizen explorer can't reach. They can reach those caves in France, those limestone caves that you were mentioning earlier. So bringing a partner on board, something like Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science in Miami has the Master's in Exploration Science degree, and that whole class of people could take on creating the analog for citizen explorers to participate in ways that are analogous to the researchers in the field. So I think a one specific academic partner like that could be really valuable. And it certainly wouldn't be a funding one, but it would be a great resource to sort of take care of the whole outreach side of things.
Thanks, Erica.
To Bob's point about sanctuaries, right now, with this new process for people nominating sanctuaries, there's a nomination that's been put forward by the Chumash for the submerged lands off of Southern California, north of Channel Islands and south of Monterey. And one of the key statements they make in that
Point
nomination,
conception area.
yeah, one of the key things they say is our ancestors are out there, and we want to see that, we want to find it, and we want to protect
it. It may be how they got there.
Yeah,
by boat.
Yeah, exactly. But but they're saying they're seeking federal designation of a sanctuary to protect what they believe the traditional culture to be a submerged paleo landscape with ancestral bones and sacred places.
It speaks to how timely this topic is in so many ways. And but we should move along. Before we introduce the next question, I want to welcome Fritz Hansen from Texas State University, who just joined us.
Nice shirt, Fritz.
Yeah.
All right.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Got it. Talking
I'll just throw it in the private industry thing. You guys mentioned it, but I think more and more people.
Once you get in view, then they can't see it.
People don't necessarily think of Silicon Valley. They think of some of the other more traditional private industry partners. And I think more and more you're going to find more companies that are interested in just doing good and having a positive impact. And companies like ours have plenty of customers who can pay us for the sophisticated technology that we have, and that leaves the door open for us to simply say, how can we help to do this stuff?
Well, and that's a good segue into the next question, because we're going to talk about what data. It says here, what data would you collect? What data will you need to address your priorities? If you could only visit this area once, what data would you need to obtain a baseline characterization? Is the resolution of data a factor? And when we think traditionally about the kinds of data that archaeologists or physical biological oceanographers collect, we don't often think about the kinds of models that can be produced using the technologies that we discussed today, photogrammetry, for example, or underwater laser scanning, acoustic data, et cetera. And those are going to be critical not only for the terrestrial models, but for the models of the submerged environment as well. So I want to talk a little bit about the kinds of data we can collect, and we put that on the table. mean, what we saw today in terms of what can be accomplished. We were talking about object scale, but also shipwreck scale. But I'm involved with a group that's scanning entire coastlines, and that's something we can do with different levels of resolution using LiDAR, for example. And that brings us into the GIS as a powerful tool for analysis and modeling. So that is a kind of data that we can touch on a bit more. So I'd like to kind of open that up, the kinds of data that we collect as part of this fundamental characterization task.
Well, you're trying to understand the landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many different aspects to understanding the landscape than simple what's the bathymetry.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, up and down's down, and they tended to probably, you look at it like we did with the Meshenteca Pequot project, was to where were they living? Remember that a lot of these people were also living where their water never got to. So it's like, there wasn't this little band that people lived in this little band, and then they got pushed out of it. There were people living on the land that's land at the same time, and you start to look at, well, how were they living? What were their resources? So it's also having a really fundamental knowledge of the people that are that were never submerged, that are nearby, to understand how you then can apply what you learn from that that behavior pattern. That how would they have lived under this now submerged area? But certainly you need to understand the micro. You need to understand the climate. You need to understand the creatures they were eating, and there's so many different aspects to understanding that ancient landscape than just topography.
Indeed.
And so you need to core samples. There's a lot of ways that you need to be able to characterize the microenvironments to know, because that's what those subtle things that where they actually then settled in. And they had when we were looking for kitchen midden, we knew that we get a kitchen midden. We weren't far from the kitchen. And so then you started looking at, well, where would they have lived given the kitchen midden was over here? And you start looking at the microtopography, and you start guessing where they were gonna actually habitate. That kind of stuff.
For me, I think what would be key, coming back to what Amy said, is that if we're going to blue sky ahead, if you're going to have an AUV that's going to go there and do the microbathymetry, I think it should also have sub-bottom profiling capacity.
Absolutely.
As well, so that there's doing.
And that's an easy thing to add.
Yeah, but it really, improve the tech so that it does better than existing sub-bottom, but really get there and tag it along, and then follow it up after you did that survey to be able, if there's only one and only chance, why not have a couple little guys come off and actually do selected sampling here and there after you've done that microbathymetry. If you got one shot at it and you've got a site that looks good, then drill in, get a core, sample DNA.
And also, given the nature of the continental borderland, we do not have a large continental shelf on the west coast, a gigantic one on the east coast. But on the west coast, you're not far from land from the sites you're studying.
That's true.
And so that's got good news and bad news. This whole thing we saw today about open ROVs, and we saw the proliferation of thousands and thousands and thousands of ROVs where people are driving around, and if you looked at the footage that you saw, they were seeing bottles, they were seeing artifacts. And so there's how engaged do you want the public in this?
Yeah,
because
and we'll
that could, that's a two-edged sword.
Yeah, we'll definitely get to that when we talk about how you engage the public. I think we have someone who just
joined us.
Over there.
Oh, I think we have a class.
Is this our classroom?
Hello there.
Hang on. I want to make sure I'm on mute.
Can you hear us? Do you want to crank up your volume?
I'm cranking up my volume. I just can't hear you.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Good. That was our bell. Yes, we are here. Thank you. I'm sorry it took us a while to get here. My class is behind me. I'm going to bring them up when they ask questions. But we definitely appreciate the opportunity to listen to you experts and to learn more about your work with submerged cultural artifacts. We are fascinated with it. Have spent the last 2 days researching each of you diligently so that we were able to ask intelligent questions. I did forward our questions to Megan, so I hope that she was able to share them with you.
Do you have them, Megan?
I have the question.
And she's going to share them with us. We can actually do that now. What's your
Yeah, we can do that now.
This afternoon?
Can I do that now? Okay. Let me just take a quick. I just have to check a couple of quick administrative things to make sure I'm not putting anyone on screen that I'm not supposed to put on screen. So just give me 1 second, and I'll have them ask you the questions. Okay, 1 second.
Okay, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, jump in and wave at us again.
Yeah, exactly.
Another thing to think about, I think, with the data is building on something my very good friend Erica said earlier as she talks about citizen science, is making sure that it's data that can be used by well beyond the experts, if you will, that traditionally use it.
Well, that brings a good. When we work with on an archaeological project, we turn off a lot of information.
Right.
So we don't. You can't track the ship.
Yeah.
We don't. We go through our whole database and make sure latitude and longitude is not. So this is an issue. It's almost like I'm carrying out a classified operation.
Yeah.
And that has a good news and bad news. That's very turn-offing to a social community when you're classifying the data.
Well,
And likely to not be sustainable as technology advances. You'll end up
watch
losing that
this
anyway.
line, and I've dealt with it, believe
Sure.
me. I got
More than most people.
Look at my back. You'll see a lot why I wear a shirt.
Yeah.
So no, it's a very explosive issue of involving citizen scientists into something like that and divulging locations of things.
But maybe that's one of the things to think about is what, as long as that's going to continue to be an issue for a little while, at least the location piece of it, what kind of data can be synthesized in such a way that it's consumable without giving away what you don't want
even I think in this
Good
case,
luck on reaching consensus.
Yeah.
I know.
I should mention that we're not talking about necessarily sites, we're talking about coastlines at this point.
Yeah.
So that characterization may not actually necessarily involve encountering material.
All right.
Exactly.
But yeah,
But it-
Yep. Okay.
Could get lucky.
Our first question is for Dominique. Are you there?
I'm
Yes?
here.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Come, you'll be asked by Julia.
Hi,
Okay, welcome.
I'm Julia, and I've got a question for you, and this is really weird.
Okay.
We don't bite.
Most of us.
You do it? Start by saying describe. All right, we have stage fright. We're going to have somebody else come. Yeah. Kayla.
We see that in an oral exam.
I can come.
You lock up.
All right.
All right, that's cool.
We have Daphne. That's okay, Julia, you're fine. Stage fright.
Okay.
Okay.
Hello.
We're starting here.
Okay, so we have for Dominique Rissolo, even though I actually did Bob Ballard, we have describe your involvement in the skeleton Naiad discovery in Rio Negro. Was it scary? How did you make you feel?
One question time. Okay.
All right, that was a lot of questions at one time, so I apologize for that.
No, that's okay. Well, I mean, I should point out that that I didn't discover Naya. I was fortunate enough to work with the discovery team. This is Alex Alvarez, Franco Attolini, and Alberto Nava who made this remarkable discovery. And they brought it to the attention of archaeologists and paleontologists who've been working in that region for many years. And you know, many of us are, you know, always sort of secretly hope that you know, that we'll get that call from folks in the underwater cave exploration community, because these kinds of discoveries are so rare. And I think because they're so rare, and because we, you know, something that we want so much to experience in our careers, that I mean, I don't think they'd be scary in any way. So, you know, I think most archaeologists who've encountered human remains, I don't think that necessarily has that sort of scary effect on us anymore. It's actually super exciting. And you know, some divers that I've been working with describe it as sort of this electrifying feeling that you're touching something that hasn't been disturbed for over 10 millennia. It's a really remarkable thing, and it's a very humbling thing. And I think one of the things to mention, it's good that you brought this question up, is that archaeologists sometimes forget that that when you find individuals, humans, who are now part of what we call the archaeological record, you know, those are still individuals with lives, with ancestors and with descendants. And so there's a certain reverence that you want to bring to these archaeological sites, because these are people who died in some way, and sometimes a very, very tragic death. And I think that's something that Bob can talk about too with Titanic, that we tend to think of Titanic as a ship, but Titanic is also in many ways a hollowed ground.
Absolutely. I think when, being the first on scene, and you have no knowledge of what you're going to encounter. And naturally, with the Titanic, the word itself, everything's Titanic down there. I mean, they didn't have small anythings. And so you were always looking up at things. But to me, the most compelling images that really grounded me was the shoes. Human bodies after the Titanic sank, humans up in the freezing water, those that didn't have life jackets finally perished, and these bodies came down like a rain of bodies, raining down after the Titanic arrived all over the place. We've seen them, same as case with the Bismarck. Every shipwreck, almost all of them, people die. And so people are associated with all these shipwrecks. But in the deep sea, animals quickly find them, and they're eaten, just like if you died in the woods. But in the deep sea, we're below what's called the calcium carbonate compensation depth, which is a fancy way of saying that as you get deep in the ocean, the water doesn't have as much calcium carbonate in it, so it dissolves bones. And we've done lots of research on how long that takes. So we've got whale drops and whale falls and other cases where we can actually determine that 7 or 10 years the bones dissolve if they're out in the oxygenated waters. But the shoes, because they're treated with tannic acid, the animals will not eat them. It's just they have very persnickety tastes. They won't eat teak because they've never met teak before, because teak doesn't get out there. So the Bismarck's deck of teak was fine, but the Titanic's deck was pine. They tasted that wood before. So, but in the case of humans, the shoes become the tombstone. They are to me, they are the marker of the grave. And you don't touch it. You don't go to Gettysburg with a shovel. You don't take belt buckles off the Arizona. These are very special places that deserve to be treated in a special way. And that's why we were totally opposed to recovery, because it wasn't like an archaeological site. I mean, the Titanic, we knew how many hard-boiled eggs were aboard. We knew all the wine that was aboard. We had a complete manifest of what was on that ship. So there wasn't an archaeological site in that context. But when you find an ancient shipwreck and you know very, very little about that period of time, then working with archaeologists under very controlled conditions, it justifies recovering a limited amount of there's no sense of bringing up the entire cargo if it's replicated, but I'll let the archaeologists speak for themselves. But in some cases, it merits to recover things. In other cases, it doesn't merit at all.
And just because bodies may be gone doesn't mean that it's not a grave site. And some of you may have seen, if you did some internet research, that Dr. Ballard and I both were debating James Cameron in the New York Times a few years ago on this very subject, because people say there's no bodies. Yeah. But Dr. Ballard has said, shoes are there, people died there, and we're not convinced that there aren't some more remains inside the ship.
Oh, I'm confident.
Yeah.
So once you get inside the Titanic, particularly in the engine room, where everyone died and perished there, it goes anoxic pretty quickly. And then as a result, you get preservation, just like we found skeletons on shipwrecks in the Black Sea in the anoxic layer. They were the skeletons from 500 BC, because they were A, shallow, so they didn't dissolve, but B, they were in an area where animals weren't there to eat them. So yeah, you just have to realize that you're coming across a very sad thing happen, and you need to treat the people who died as well as the families that lived after them with respect.
You guys had more?
Yep. Yes. Wait.
This is Andy. This is Andy Hemming. Sorry, I've been watching the whole time, but I couldn't join right away. One aspect of how we're discussing how quickly technology changes, the people may actually be there. We are now able to sample background environmental ancient DNA. We call it eDNA. And it's entirely possible that now to go back, like knowing where the shoes were, and realizing that that's where a person was, their genetic signature may in fact be preserved in the sediments below where they were laying.
So they had another student. Do you have a question for someone else?
Yeah, we have a question.
Just your first name.
My name is Tommy and Gabe. We had a question from Frit Hanselman. If you find gold or any other resources with a value to them, do you get to keep them or no?
That's a good question. I had to make sure I was off mute this time before I answered. That's a good question. That's a question that a lot of us field as archaeologists when it comes to ownership of artifacts. And the short answer is we don't keep them because we believe that the artifacts they belong to the public. They belong to us as a people. So even coins or gold bars or anything that somebody might think of that has a commercial value, we look at that as something that could give us historical value. For example, we were working on some shipwrecks in 2013 in the Gulf of Mexico, and they're about 4,500 feet deep, so almost a mile. And we were actually on Bob's ship, and Jim and I and a few of our other colleagues were out there, and we found some coins. And the value to us from those coins was the fact that we actually got real dates on those coins that allowed us to narrow the window of time in which that ship would have been active and when they would have sank. So that's sort of the long answer. The short answer is no, we don't keep any of that. We don't sell it. And what we get from that.
And did you get to keep?
Maybe we'll take one more. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Maybe one more quick question, and we'll jump back into our itinerary.
Okay. Did you get to keep anything from Captain Morgan's ship or no?
Well, yeah. Well, I'm technically not allowed to talk about any of that to people under 21. But you know what? The funny story is that the ship turned out to be Spanish. It turned out to be a Spanish shipwreck from 1681. So same time period, contemporary to Captain Morgan. But using the scientific method, we disproved our original hypothesis that it could potentially be his wreck. So the cannons that we found are from Morgan's ships, his lost ships that we are still looking for. But the one shipwreck we did find is actually a Spanish merchant ship that went down with over 100 wooden chests intact and all that. So it's a cool site. It ended up it's not Morgan's, and we didn't get to keep anything from it. But the artifacts that we did sample are undergoing conservation so they can be exhibited in a lab in Panama City.
I think the important thing on that, by the way, is that when Fritz and I surfed underwater over that reef and found those guns, we landed on a wreck site that had been explored by others and had been torn apart. I mean, there were pits and holes in the reef, and at one stage it was supposedly more than 40 guns. What did we find, Fritz? 8?
Yeah, 8 guns.
Somebody else had taken them, and they're gone, and we don't know where they are. In some cases, they probably just disintegrated, because if you don't treat the metal, it falls apart. And that comes back to that question about the gold. If people think that everything that comes off the bottom has a value, and they want to grab it, they don't have the ability to take care of it, it's like tearing pages out of a book that you can never get back because it's a handwritten book. So that's a good thing for students to think about, is why we do the science as carefully as we do, and why we're having this discussion now, because in some cases we may be the first ones there, and if that's the case, it's like any explorer's responsibility is to tread lightly, not make an impact, and if you do make an impact, document everything, just basic science.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thanks, Jim. We're going to go ahead and continue on with we only have about 20 minutes or so left, and I wanted to move through our questionnaire so as to stay on track.
Great question, guys, and,
really
and please
appreciate
keep
it.
stay tuned in. You don't have to go away.
Okay, we'll head off now because we're nearly ready for ending as well. But we appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye. Study hard.
We can see you down below. Generation explorers. So wonderful. We left off with our discussion on data. I think we have we didn't talk specifically about cores, which of course would be fundamental in terms of characterizing
just pollen.
sediments.
I mean, you want to know that the environment.
Because we're talking about paleo-environmental reconstruction.
Well, it's also coming back to what Andy said. It's eDNA as well. That was one of the most exciting things.
Well, which is a bold new frontier for